Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. Let's start our video with a story in which our OP goes to one of his son's Little League baseball games prepared with an easy-up canopy and chairs for comfort and finds himself in a situation where he has to fight for the shadow. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. Lady get mad at me for moving my canopy so I'll be in the shade. I pretend I can't understand them. A few years ago, when my wife and I were still dating, we went to one of my son's Little League baseball games. We knew in advance which baseball field it would be played in, so we already knew they had no seating for spectators and no shade either. I brought lawn chairs and an easy-up, a canvas canopy with 4 legs. When the game was about to start, we picked out a spot down the first baseline where we could set up our chairs and the easy-up. Several parents were already there to watch their own kids play. Like us, most of them brought their own chairs. I figured I'd start with the easy-up, then I'd go back to the car to get the chairs. Among the parents who were watching the game, there were 2 ladies, who I assume were Vietnamese, that were paying particular attention to me as I put the easy-up. They were about 20 feet away from where I was putting the canopy up, but they kept turning around and looking at me, talking about what I was doing and pointing at me. I got the impression that they had a problem with what I was doing, but I'd seen people with canopies at the games before, and I'd set up behind everyone, so I didn't see what the problem was. When I'd finished putting up the canopy, I asked my wife, girlfriend at the time, to stay with the canopy while I went back to the car to get the chairs. The car wasn't parked very far away. When I got the chairs from the car and headed back to the canopy, the 2 ladies had gotten up and were moving their chairs to be under the shade of my canopy. This was in the afternoon, so the shade provided by the canopy was already several feet away from being directly under the canopy. Instead of being under the canopy, the shade was a few feet to the right of the canopy, leaving the underneath side of the canopy directly in the sun. These ladies set their chairs down right in the middle of the shade of my canopy and were sitting there talking to each other in what I could only guess was Vietnamese. It might have been Thai or Laotian or something else, but whatever it was, they were talking to one another and seemed to be very happy with themselves for beating me to the shade provided by my own canopy. I unfolded the chairs beneath the canopy and asked my wife, "How's that?" My wife sat down in the chair and said, "Good, but we're still in the sun." "No problem," I said. There was no one to the left of us, so I picked up the canopy by one of the legs and dragged it across the ground to the left until the shade was covering our chairs. As I did this, the 2 Asian ladies looked up and around like they're trying to figure out why their shade was disappearing, as if it wasn't completely obvious that I was moving my own canopy so I could sit under the shade I had intended to provide for myself and my wife. I'd already been married for 9 years to a really crappy person, so I had a lot of practice in dealing with selfish people who thought of only themselves. I wasn't about to sit there and just suffer in the sun when I'd been the one to bring the canopy for myself and for my wife. These ladies were mad, though. I don't know what they were thinking, but they had the impression that they were entitled to the shade from my canopy because they had sat down there first. "You put that back," one of them said. She had a really thick accent. "You can't move that." What now?" I asked. I couldn't believe it. "You took the shade. We were sitting here and you took it," the other one said. I was in disbelief that the 2 women would both come to the same conclusion. I wondered if it was some kind of cultural thing, like maybe where they're from it was bad manners to provide something and then take it away, or maybe if they'd gotten there first, they thought they were entitled to it. I didn't know and didn't care. Those 2 then turned to each other and were squawking back and forth in whatever language they both spoke, then turned back to me. "You put it back," one of them said again. What?" I asked. "This is mine. I brought it." No, the other one said, then said something I didn't understand. "You put it back," the first one said again. The second one said something else I couldn't understand. "Yeah," I said, "I'm here to watch the game in the shade. I don't know what you're saying." The first one said something else again in English. Rather than argue, I just pretended I couldn't understand either of them, no matter what they said. Every time they said something, I just answered with, "Okay, thank you." This just made them more mad. I got them to speak louder and slower and to use different words, but I would keep answering like I had no idea what they were saying. At one point, one of them was saying, "We sit here, you move shade, you sit there, you move back." I shrugged my shoulders and said, "I don't know what you mean. I'm sitting here, this is my chair, I brought it." Those two ladies sat there and squawked back and forth, kept pointing at me, pointing at the canopy, and pointing at the shade the whole game. As the game wore on, the shade kept moving away from my wife and me due to the angle of the sun and kept moving towards these two ladies. I'd wait until the shade was just about to touch them before I'd get up and move the canopy again. I cannot fathom why these ladies thought they could use something you brought with you to use. While I'm not against sharing, asking politely is generally a good way to start. And our second story. Neighbor tried to steal part of my property. A few years back, we bought our house in a blazing hot market. It's an older home, and one of the things we loved most about it was this beautiful 15-foot-tall hedgerow on one side of our backyard. Thick, mature, and providing perfect privacy. With kids and dogs in the mix, we decided to put up a fence to keep everyone safely inside and went over to chat with our neighbors about trimming the hedge. They were perfectly fine with it, or so we thought. In fact, we decided to keep the hedge and just put the fence in front of it because it added so much to the yard's vibe. Fast forward a year, and I look outside to see the neighbors hacking away at our gorgeous hedge without a word of warning. I rushed over, mid-cut, and asked them if they'd done a survey to prove it was theirs. Of course they hadn't. I told them I loved the hedge and wanted to keep it. Their response? Keep chopping. By the time they were done, the entire hedgerow was gone. What a punch to the gut. After the massacre, we finally spotted survey pins on their side of the fence, a solid 5 feet over the property line. Furious, I got the survey on file from the city, and sure enough, the hedge was on our property. They'd torn down our hedge, taken over 10 feet of our land, moved the survey pins, and built a shed, garden boxes, and planted new shrubs all up against our fence. But the audacity didn't stop there. A few days later, they had the nerve to slip a note in our mailbox telling us we needed to cut their side of another shared hedge that divides our driveways, a hedge we'd never touched because it's shared. The entitlement was unreal. So today I decided it was time for a conversation. I went over to confront the neighbor. Me. "Hey, I want to talk to you about the property line. I believe that section of land actually belongs to us." Neighbor. "No way. You should have done zoning when you bought the house. It's mine." Me. "But I saw where you moved the survey pins. You know that's illegal, right?" Neighbor. "Back off, idiot." And that's when I knew this wasn't a conversation that was going to end well without legal help. It's time to bring in the big guns. Not only am I planning to request that they pay to have the fence moved back to its rightful location on their dime, but after hearing the way they spoke to me, I won't be surprised if they end up dealing with a much bigger problem than a property line dispute. They messed with the wrong neighbor. Update. I hired a lawyer and got everything lined up, armed with the survey proving that the land was ours and evidence of the moved pins. My lawyer made it clear this was an open and shut case of property theft. The neighbors had no leg to stand on. Fast forward a few months, and we're sitting in court. My neighbor, still full of attitude, tried to argue that the property was theirs and that we'd made a mistake. Between the survey evidence, the fact that they'd moved the pins, which is very illegal, and their blatant disregard for property laws, it was game over for them. The judge ruled in our favor, and I have to admit, watching the neighbor's smug expression drop was priceless. They were ordered to pay for all the damages. This included the cost of moving our fence back to the correct location, but they also had to cover the expense of replanting new shrubs. The cherry on top, they were forced to demolish the shed and garden boxes they'd built on our land. The kicker, they even had to pay for the legal fees. Justice served. And our last story. Tenant keeps letting visitors park in my spot, and now he says he'll tow my car on my own property. I own a residential triplex in Ontario and live in one of the units. The other 2 units are rented out, and the setup seems pretty straightforward. 3 units, 3 parking spots, 1 for each, no visitor parking, which is clearly spelled out in the lease. Simple, right? Apparently not for one of my tenants, who seems to think my parking spot is fair game. For the past 3 years, this tenant has consistently allowed his visitors to park in my space. I'd come home after a long day and, surprise, someone would be parked in my spot. It's even worse in the winter because street parking is basically non-existent, leaving me stuck circling the block or parking far from my own home. Every time I'd ask them to move, they would, but it was happening way too often. Last night was the final straw. After another exhausting day, I pulled up to find his visitor parked in my spot yet again. I'd had enough. I parked my car directly behind the visitor, blocking them in. A little while later, my tenant came banging on my door, furious, demanding I move my car. I refused, telling him his visitor could leave when I went to work in the morning. He lost it, started yelling, calling me all sorts of names, and even threatened to kick my butt. I let him stew for about 10 minutes before I finally moved my car, but not before making my point. He had the audacity to threaten that if I ever did that again, he'd tow my car off the property. Seriously, the guy who's in the wrong thinks he can tow my car? For some extra context, this isn't the only issue with this tenant. He's been consistently late with rent payments, and I've already been working on an eviction process. Update. After my tenant's ridiculous outburst and towing threat, I decided enough was enough. I contacted my lawyer to clarify my rights, and sure enough, as the property owner, I have every right to manage parking on my own land. If anyone's car was getting towed, it was going to be his visitors, not mine. I formally issued him a warning about the parking violations, making it crystal clear that this was his last straw. But that's not all. I fast-tracked the eviction process for his late rent payments. He now has a limited time to either pay up or pack up. Since then, I haven't had any more issues with parking, and the other tenants have been respectful of the rules. Hopefully, soon I'll have a new renter who understands the concept of leases and basic decency. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.